Good afternoon. My name is Joe Bandel, and I am the last Rosicrucian. This is the conclusion of my introduction and my own personal story, at least the parts of it that I'm sharing for right now. I've left off by saying that I had achieved a mystical unity or oneness with cosmic consciousness, with all things, where I could feel that there was no separation, that everything was connected, that I was connected to the entire universe. And I tried to dissolve myself in that feeling of bliss, that feeling of love and light. And for a while it worked. But soon, to my horror, I realized that as soon as I would stop pushing, as soon as I would stop trying to go further into the light, I'd be back. I'd be pulled back. Pulled back is not the thing. It was more like pushing your finger into a balloon, and as soon as you let up, you come back out of the balloon. That's more like what it actually was like. I found out I couldn't go any further. And then I found out that the dynamics in my head were starting to cross back downward, in a downward direction, back into the mental functioning. The unity functioning was going into the spiritual functioning and blending, and I was getting these spiritual insights and filling in these gaps, and it was powerful, it was overwhelming. But after that, and I started writing it down, and the things that I wrote in my book that I wrote, Magister Templi, reflect a lot of those insights that I was experiencing at the archetypal realm. And I wanted to put them down because these things felt so profound and so far-reaching that I didn't want to lose them. But then I could feel, as they came down into the mental levels, and there was a shift because it came back down across the great abyss again, back into mental functioning. And that really, I felt sad. It was devastating. I felt like I was falling back to earth. It felt like I was denied the spirit, I was denied the love, I was denied God, like I was being pushed away. That's in my mind, that's how I felt at the time. But until I realized, and it took a long time for me to realize this, what I was doing was I was bringing that light, I was bringing that love back down to earth. So I was not being pushed away. Not by any means. I was embracing it, and it was coming back with me. I was carrying it back to the earth. And that coming back to the earth was part of a polarity shift. Instead of being drawn to the light like a magnet, I became drawn to the earth, drawn to the deepest, darkest, densest things. And that was the second path. That's the path of magic. And every soul in its development, at one point or another, needs to walk both paths. The path of the mystic and the path of magic. And this was my turn to walk the path of magic. And as my awareness came back down into my body, I had another psychotic episode. This time it was a healthy episode because it was healing. It was taking the parts of me that had been broken when I was 21, and it was hooking them back in. It was unifying it. And those parts of me that I had left behind 21 years ago all of a sudden woke up, and they were activated in my life. And they were still 21 years old, because here I was 20 years later, and they hadn't aged. So and they woke up, and I had to deal with those things. But that was a healing part. In the process, I was going through a divorce, a separation from my children, a loss of job, and a move out of the Air Force back to Minnesota. It was massive things that I was struggling with and trying to cope with. But even more it was a healing process that was profound. I started going to a psychologist just to keep track, because there was so much going on inside my head and my emotions that I felt I needed it to be monitored to make sure I was dealing with it all right. And I was dealing with it all right. It was fine. But she said actually that my personality at the time was plastic. It was that much going on. I remember one time walking home and going past the theater, and I looked at the theater, and there was a movie showing, and it said Braveheart. And I thought, oh, King Arthur and the knights and all of this stuff. I said, I'm going to go in. I feel like, watching a little fantasy or whatever. And so I went in there, and it wasn't like that at all. This was bare knuckle fighting in a ring with no rules. And it was brutal. It was savage. It was the most brutal movie I'd ever watched in my life. And every time this guy got hit, I'd flinch. And what happened after that, the shock was so great that when I went home, for 2 hours I was weeping, I was crying, as I experienced every time in my life that I had been struck in punishment, or like that, or any pain that I had experienced, or injury. I mean, and those were releasing spontaneously, uncontrollably, and all I could do was lay on the sofa and sob. It was healing, but it was brutal. It was exhausting. I thought I was losing my mind. I went to support groups too. But what it was all my previous life, on my mystical journey, I did not allow myself to feel my emotions, because they were wounded so bad. I had left them behind at the age of 21. All of a sudden I was reconnecting with my emotional nature, reconnecting with those emotional wounds, and I was releasing that trapped, repressed energies. So it was something that was powerful, it was something that was needed, but it was scary. And I wasn't going crazy, but I thought I was. I also, at the time, became interested in Freemasonry. I became a member of the Freemasons, the York Rite. followed it to its Templar degrees, and I joined the OTO. And I'll be talking about these things a little later. I was initiated into the OTO and studied Crowley because I was studying the magic. And this would have been ceremonial type magic to begin with. Later I studied paganism, Wicca, all of these things, the Native American spirituality, because I was now on a magical path, trying to get back to the earth, trying to regain some sense of power, because I was actually helpless at this point. I had been so far out into outer space, I had no earth connection. And I desperately wanted to regain that magical link back to the earth. That journey lasted for 25 years. And I'm happy to say that it finally completed itself. And just in these last few years. But both paths need to be followed. That's the main point that I'm leaving you with. The two paths of mysticism and magic. And they're paths of balance, because there are ways in which you can balance the male and the female inside of you. Because one path is associated with the female, and one path is associated with the male aspects of the soul and what's inside. I would also like to mention that this concludes the introductory portion of what I'm sharing, and I'm going to go way back in time in antiquity to the roots of the Western mystery traditions and my understanding of them, and this mystical, magical path. It's pretty fascinating. I don't know of anybody else. Personally, I don't know. There are people out there, but I have followed these paths myself. So, to their conclusions, to their natural conclusions, and I'm in a position to be able to share some things from firsthand experience that other people can only share from a theoretical perspective. And that makes all the difference in the world when it comes right down to it. Because we are at a war for this world. We're at a war between the mystical, magical path and a path of pure materialism that does not believe in the spirit, that does not believe in the soul. More about that later. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.